Hi, perhaps you recognize me. It's your favorite president.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
And if the yes vote is successful, we will be divided forever.
What does confrontation mean? It means you fight for what you believe.
We've got Trump-a-mania running this country, brother.
Unless you're scripted, you're useless.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of Commanding the Narrative. My name is Stephen Tripp. Thank you to everyone who is watching this. And if you are watching this live, you can contribute to today's conversation in the chat, or the link to StreamYard is also in the chat if you want to call in and ask a question or have your say. We haven't had too many callers lately, so don't be shy, don't be scared. We want to hear from you. So these conversations are always best when it's interactive and we hear from you, the audience. So as I said, don't be shy. Please let us know what you think. Now, let's kick things off like we always do, and that's by letting you know how you can follow us. And the best place to go is commandingthenarrative.com. Don't rely on social media because I get so many messages these days telling us that we're shadow banned, which is interesting. But head straight to the website. All our podcasts are up there, any articles that I might write, and also events coming up. There's quite a few events coming up with the lead up to the election. If you want to know the upcoming podcast, you can find it here. And also this one, which plays in today's discussion as well, because we have one of the speakers on today, Zoe Hilton, which is going to be interesting. But Senator Matt Canavan's now announced for the Securing Energy Future Symposium. It's on Wednesday, April 2nd at 7 p.m. at the Balgala Bowling Club. So having Senator Canavan speak is going to be great for anyone that's living on the Northern Beaches or in Sydney. If you can come along, it's only $25 tickets. Jared Holland of the Page Research Centre that I interviewed recently, that was a fantastic interview. He's going to be speaking. And also Paul Vallejo, who you should know from the podcast, will be there as well. So that's going to be a great night. Please come along. Also, this Saturday, it's the Put the Greens Last rally up in Brisbane. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be speaking. Also, Monica Spint, Jim Wilmot of the Libertarian Party, Katie McCallum, who've had on the podcast plenty of times, and also Malcolm Roberts and Jared Rennick will be speaking at this rally. It's at Anzac Park in Toowong. As I said, this Saturday at 10 o'clock. So please come along to that one. You got a free T-shirt and a whole bunch of different things. Going to be a lot of interesting stuff happening, so please come and join us for that one. And just lastly, the Australians for Better Government fundraiser coming up Sunday, May 25th at noon at the Warrawee Club in Warrawee. John Ruddick of the Libertarian Party is announced as a speaker. Hopefully we'll announce more speakers in the coming weeks, so that one will be good as well. But head to Commanding the Narrative. You'll find commandingthenarrative.com. You'll find all the links to those events coming up and everything else. When you're there, please hit the sign up button in the top right hand corner. You get a weekly newsletter from me. And also, if you want to hit the donate button, it just helps to contribute to what we're doing here, helps to pay for the stream, helps to pay for the website, and most importantly, gives me a warm and fuzzy feeling inside, which is very, very important. So please head to commandingthenarrative.com. You'll find all of that there. Also, I should let you know about Australians for Better Government. I let you know every single time because it is so important that we get people signing up to Australians for Better Government. When you're on the website, you can hit the button up the top that says Our Mission, and you'll find out everything that we are standing for: reforming the Constitution, ensuring a true separation of powers, improving the quality of the vote, enshrining our freedoms, and also direct democracy. All our proposals are on the website. The more members that we have, the better our movement will be. And also, if you can contribute via donations, that will be much appreciated as well. It means we can host more events and get the name out there and spread the word in a much better capacity. And lastly, before we get to today's interview, I'll let you know about the Light newspaper. A new edition of the Light is out at the moment. It's a great edition, a lot of great articles in there. So if you want to help independent media and getting the uncensored truth out to people, please head to thelightaustralia.com. And if you want to sign up to be a distributor, you can do that. Now, on today's show, as I said, we have Zoe Hilton of the Centre for Independent Studies. She's the senior policy analyst in the energy department. And as I said, she's going to be speaking at the Securing Our Energy Future Symposium in Balgala. So it'd be a good opportunity to talk to her before of that, ahead of that symposium, and see how amazing and talented she is. So let's bring her on. Zoe Hilton, welcome to Commanding the Narrative.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
No, not a problem. Maybe let's kick off by letting the audience know a little bit about you. What's your background and what led you to the CIS?
So I've been at CIS for a bit over a year now. And before that, I was working in the New South Wales Government. So I worked as the Science and Trade Advisor to Alastair when he was the Minister for a whole bunch of portfolios, basically science, trade, skills, and sport. And so that gave me a good understanding of policy from the inside of government. But prior to that, I had worked in think tanks before and done some little bit of energy policy research, science policy research, and studied science and arts. So that's my background.
And why are you so interested in the energy space?
I think at the moment, energy is really where science and policy are meeting, and it's the thing that is just impacting everyone's lives, because we used to pretty much take it for granted that we could have as much electricity as we needed when we wanted it. We didn't really have to think too much about turning on, the washing machine or at what time. And now that's it's just not a reality for people anymore. They have to worry about the energy bills, which is insane when we live in this nation that has been blessed with so many energy resources. And so I think we need to be seriously questioning, why have our electricity costs continued to increase and increase and increase compared to other similar countries when we have all of these advantages? And that's really the question that I've been working on, with our team at CIS.
Tell us a little bit about the CIS. I'm sure you attract a lot of criticism from the other side of politics that say you're just a right-wing think tank and you're just a shill for the Liberal Party. What, in your words, what is the Centre for Independent Studies?
So I think really where we are a sort of mostly leaning free markets, classical liberal centre-right think tank. I think that's an accurate way of describing us, but that doesn't mean Liberal Party think tank. So I've been very critical of certain former Liberal energy ministers who have made bad decisions, and former Liberal prime ministers as well. So, for example, Malcolm Turnbull's decision to invest in Snowy Hydro 2.0, I think that was a terrible decision. It was not a good investment, and it's costing taxpayers billions now, and not for very much value that we're getting out of it. So, so I think we will be critical of politicians on both sides if we think that they are making policy choices that are going to hurt Australians. And we will talk to policymakers on both sides. We will talk to any politicians who are interested in what we have to say, because it's really important that, I don't want energy to be a partisan issue. I want it to be a bipartisan thing that we all agree on. We can say, yes, this is the way forward. This is the cheapest, the cleanest, all of the above, the most reliable energy. It is sad that it has to be so partisan. So.
When you talk about speaking to the politicians about this stuff, what is the feedback when you're discussing this stuff with them? Do you think they're across it? Do you think they completely understand what you're talking about when you're speaking about the energy grid?
I think we've had good feedback, but I think it is rare to find politicians who are really across the detail. And I will say, I think in terms of like Ted O'Brien speaking from opposition as the opposition spokesman for energy, I think he has done a very good job of getting across the detail as much as he can. He really knows his stuff. I think the current federal energy minister, Chris Bowen, less so. But yeah, so I think it definitely varies, but it is challenging because there's not a lot of engineers who are politicians. That's quite rare. And I think politicians, they need to have technical people that they can rely on to be supporting them with that information, because I think it is somewhat unrealistic for a politician to fully understand all of the ins and outs of the energy system. But it needs to be someone who can take on board the advice and the challenges, and not kind of just go, well, things should work out because they have to, but actually make the hard choices and be willing to be brave and go against the overarching narrative that is currently prevailing. I think that's what's needed.
Yep. Now, speaking of engineering and being technical, you co-authored this document here, which is the 6 fundamental flaws underpinning the energy transition. Now, if you hit the conclusion, which I like to do, head straight to the conclusion and try and get the best summary of what you've said. In the last paragraph here, it says the current debate is undermined by CSIRO and aemo, producing flawed analysis that have allowed the government to maintain a pretense that this debate is an unnecessary distraction by allowing the persistent defense of the proposition that a reliable renewable-based system is cheaper than the status quo, as well as nuclear. The prospect of a mature and civil debate has been reduced. aemo and CSIRO should correct the flaws in their analysis and enable the energy debate Australians desperately need to have. Now, based on that summary, and you don't have to go into the whole report, but what are some of the things that stand out in your mind from this report when you're talking about the flawed analysis from aemo and CSIRO?
So I think one of the biggest is consume energy resources. And that is essentially rooftop solar, home batteries, EVs, that aemo just assumes will be there to support the grid. So they assume a 30-fold increase in home batteries and a 4-fold increase in rooftop solar by 2050. And none of that is included as a cost in the model. So they essentially build into every scenario in the ISP that consumers will go out and make these purchases, make these investments, and all of that capacity will just be there for the grid, but none of that will cost anything. It won't increase costs. And the problem is that when someone is making a purchase like that, they're only, generally speaking, except for the early adopters, but most people are only going to make that decision to buy a rooftop solar or a home battery if they think they're going to get a financial return, if they think they're going to save money in the long run. And that means that they have to be saving more than they are spending overall. They've got to be saving it from the energy bills, right? And so if they're saving money on the energy bills, then other people are going to have to be paying enough that they can get those payments in the form of savings. And so basically what that means is it increases the total system costs, which increases electricity bills as a whole. And the problem arises where aemo takes it as an input that is fixed instead of optimizing alongside large-scale generation. So if large-scale solar, for example, and large-scale battery storage is cheaper than small-scale solar and battery storage, which we know is true according to the CSIRO's report, they say large-scale is cheaper, especially for storage, then that would mean that if we're encouraging people to go out and buy small-scale stuff, that's going to increase costs overall. So I think that if they had actually co-optimized and really gone, okay, what is the lowest cost system? Is it more of the large stuff? Is it more of the small stuff? Then they'd come up with an answer of, we need pretty much probably no rooftop solar or home batteries. We just need to focus on the large scale because it's more efficient. Now, whether or not large scale renewables in general is a good idea is a whole other question. But even if you wanted a 90% renewables grid, the current grid we're building by focusing on these consumer energy resources is not going to be the lowest cost grid, and therefore it's not going to result in lowest cost energy bills for the end consumer.
Like, all of this is based on modeling, and if anyone's been following this whole debate for the last 20, 30 years or whatever it has been, the climate change debate, it's all a lot of it's based on modeling, and a lot of the time that modeling doesn't come true. I know this is a very broad question, but how do you feel about modeling? Do you think we can rely on modeling a lot of the time?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question because it really comes down to how good is the model? How well can it reflect reality? Because if we don't model anything ever, then we're really just going to be taking a stab in the dark trying to figure out what we should build in the future. So we need to have some kind of modeling in order to give us a plan, but we need to be modeling actual realistic futures. So, for example, I was just listening to a webinar that aemo was doing, which is basically consulting on the inputs to the next ISP, the next big planning document. And they were still, even despite all of the current, like the very recent announcements from government and industry pulling out of hydrogen plants, aemo is still assuming there are going to be hydrogen electrolyzers there in the future. And what these hydrogen electrolyzers are assumed to do is that they can ramp down during the evening peak and then ramp back up when there's plentiful solar during the middle of the day. And that massively improves the business case for renewables, particularly for solar power. So it makes things look cheaper than they actually are by assuming that this whole industry will just exist, which currently is really struggling because green hydrogen is just not cost effective and maybe never will be. I mean, it's really pinning our hopes on a pipe dream. And so when you include things like that in your model, it's just garbage in, garbage out, really. Like models need to be rooted in reality. And it also is tricky because you need to be thinking about, like, oh, can the grid get through every second of the day? It's not just, can it get through this hour or this hour? Like, the grids run on these very, very fine timescales. And so that is a problem with a lot of the modeling, is that they can't be fine-grained enough because they're not using enough computing power, essentially, to figure out what if solar output drops 80% in 5 minutes, which does happen in solar farms, according to aemo. Then will the grid be okay? With gas, peaking gas, if you're running gas like this instead of just very steady, with, going up and down a little bit with the peaks, can the gas infrastructure deal with that? And we've had other modeling from Paul Simshauser, who has done some excellent work on this, on the gas question, showing that we're going to have shortages, and the current infrastructure, the pipelines, cannot deal with these huge up and downs that aemo is requiring it to do in its model in the future. So in some ways, I think you can have to combat bad modeling. Sometimes, you just need good modeling. But the first step needs to be, with this particular bad modeling that aemo is doing and that CSIRO have done, is pulling apart the threads, where they've snagged, where they don't make sense. We need to point out all of these fundamental flaws in order to fix them, in order to get back to some level of sanity, so that the future grid we're modeling actually makes sense with reality.
A lot of the policies of people like Chris Bowen or the Greens or the Teals is really underpinned by this GenCost report from the CSIRO. When you're going through something like GenCost, what's your reaction? Do you find it incredibly frustrating, or is there good information in there? What's your initial reaction when you're going through the document?
So I think it is frustrating in the sense that the CSIRO authors behind GenCost haven't released all of the data necessary to replicate it. So everyone likes to talk about, replicating studies, peer review, all of that. It has to be repeatable in order to be science. Like that's the point of science, right? And I mean, this isn't really science. This is economics and engineering, but the CSIRO have demonstrated this complete lack of transparency in their GenCost report because they don't give us all the details necessary to actually replicate their model and check their work. So we just have to basically trust them on all of these things. And the reason why they don't do that is because they don't want to contradict the ISP, which is much more detailed in its modeling. Which would be fair enough, except that the ISP, as I said before, is very, very flawed. And crucially, the ISP takes as given all government targets, including the federal government's 82% renewables by 2030 target, which you ask pretty much any energy expert, even ones who love renewables, and they will tell you 82% renewables by 2030 will not happen. Like, that's ridiculous, and we're nowhere near there, and they should drop that target. But yeah, so the ISP assumes that. And then GenCost goes, oh, well, we're not going to release all our modeling because we don't want to contradict them, aka the government's plan, essentially. And so instead of the CSIRO providing robust modeling that would allow us to have kind of an objective basis from which to check the government's plan, they've said, no, we're not going to release all of that because we don't want to contradict the government's plan. And then when you look at the assumptions, for example, for storage costs, they assume a less costs for storage for a given amount of renewables, like 90% renewables, than aemo assumes in their plan. So GenCost is actually more optimistic than the ISP, than the report that they're saying they are trying to use as a benchmark. So this is very concerning because if they're even more optimistic, then what are their assumptions, which they're not revealing? How much wind, how much solar, how much gas? It's very hard for us to check, but it doesn't smell right. There are a lot of very questionable things that they've done. And for example, capacity factors for renewables, they've included these very, very optimistic capacity factors, which improves the business case for renewables. And then turned around, and for nuclear, they've given this very, very pessimistic range all the way down to 53%. And so essentially that would be like building a nuclear plant and then running it only half of the time and shutting it off so that solar output can go into the grid. Like it's this very uneven playing field that they've set up in this report that's supposed to be providing objective analysis. And so then you have, Bowen essentially repeating the findings of this report. And of course, he's not going to question any of the assumptions because it tells him what he wants to hear.
It's funny. It reminds me of when I was on the polling booth in the Pittwater by-election recently, and I was talking to one of the teal volunteers about how he felt about nuclear. And he was saying, oh, well, and I said, well, how do you, he's like, nuclear just won't work here in Australia. And I said, well, why not? How come countries overseas have it? And he said, well, they have it, but it's not producing that much power. And I said, well, what about France? It has 80% of their, I think I said 70% of their power coming from nuclear. And he didn't even know that. He said, I'll have to go and research that. He wasn't even aware. So funnily enough, I had the opportunity of interviewing a French politician in the weeks after that. I made sure I asked him that question. He said, we could have 100% reliance on nuclear energy if the EU got out of the way. They're the ones forcing us to have renewables in our system. So it just goes to show that, a country can be reliant on nuclear energy. But to say that, if we were to have nuclear, only 50% of our power would come from that source is it doesn't match what we see overseas.
Yes. I think, and that is a good question of why is it that all of these governments and the EU and Canada as well, this happened in Canada where they signed on to these wind projects that then ended up being very, very expensive instead of just using all the nuclear that they've got. Why do these governments feel the need to really, really support renewables. Like it's almost like emissions reduction is no longer the actual goal, because if that's what people really cared about, then surely they would be supporting nuclear as well, since it's reliable and all that. It seems like it's this ideological belief in renewables are good and everything else is not. Like and I think, and you do wonder, I mean, how much of this is vested interest, because you do have a lot of people with a lot of vested interests in wind and solar. And currently, I mean, look at the capacity investment scheme in Australia. That is taxpayers underwriting wind solar battery projects. So basically, if those investors in those projects don't earn a particular threshold, if they're earning below a particular threshold, taxpayers are going to have to make up whatever that difference is. And we don't know how much that's going to cost. And so you just have governments throwing money at these projects when the market is actually telling people we don't need any more of this. Like wind and solar is earning less and less and less when you compare the capture price to the wholesale weighted general like average price. Wind and solar is earning less and less money because it's less and less valuable to the grid as we install more and more of it. And yet the government is going, oh, well, that means we need to subsidize more to get even more of this thing, which is destabilizing our grid and is not helping with the times when we're actually facing shortages. And you just go, why? Like the whole point of that scheme in the first place was to provide dispatchable capacity like gas. And the government has just ruled gas out because of pressure from people who don't like fossil fuels. Like there are just decisions being made that are very much from an ideological position and don't even really make sense with the stated goals of what we're trying to do.
No, you've hit the nail on the head. I think we need to go back to the beginning, why we started this journey in the first place. It was all about climate change and global warming and all that sort of stuff. So nuclear should fit into that plan. But for some reason, as you said, ideology has gotten in the way, and here we are. But I want to bring up this chart that you sent me. It's a couple of charts, and it's comparing the GenCost estimates to more realistic cost estimates. Do you want to just discuss these quickly?
Yeah, so you can see the original estimates that GenCost provided on the left-hand side. So nuclear, they've put right up there. And renewables and coal are actually pretty close. They overlap quite a lot. And so, but then obviously on the top end, you can see that renewables are cheaper than more expensive coal. But when we actually fix those numbers, you can see that nuclear is, hang on, where am I looking? Sorry. Yeah, so the capacity factors, that's an important point. I just explained that briefly. So the capacity factor is what is the input that gives the range. So those like bars where you're looking at like a top value and a bottom value, that's determined by how much of the time the technology is at full output. That's sort of a good explanation of what capacity factor means. So when we look at that nuclear bar, GenCost has assumed 53% as the lowest capacity factor and then 89% as the highest capacity factor. But realistically, if you then look at the right-hand side and you've got a cross down the bottom, we could achieve pretty much 90% capacity factor, which is what the US achieves. We should be aiming for that if we were to build nuclear plants. And then when you look at the renewables bar, they've got 20% solar, 29% for wind. And that's on their original estimates. Those capacity factors were the bottom range, right? Whereas their upper range of capacity factors were 32% and 48%. Now, 19%, 29%, around about there, those are actually way more realistic. So their lower range is what we see in reality, and the upper range is just completely unrealistic. And so we actually have to put the X at their lower range, which makes it a lot more expensive, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And what we've also done is we have added in plus 39% storage cost, because when we looked at the ISP and we calculated the numbers of, okay, how much more does the ISP say we need in storage compared to GenCost, it was about 40%. That being said, that's very generous to renewables. It's probably a much, much bigger storage cost that would be needed, because the ISP is also very optimistic. So this is very much a conservative estimate. We are giving renewables as much benefit of the doubt in this. And still, even just fixing that, you can see that renewables ends up being the most expensive and nuclear ends up being in the middle, and coal is cheap. Coal has always been cheap. It will always be the cheapest. And what GenCost did to coal was pretty shocking in their analysis, because they assumed that we would be having this advanced ultra supercritical plant at these steam temperatures and pressures which have never been seen before in the world. So they basically assumed this really efficient plant that is more expensive and has never been built anywhere, instead of just basing the theoretical plant they were costing on an actual plant we've already built, like Hogan Creek, which is a supercritical plant. And there are some other things they did where they basically cherry picked fuel prices. So you have like the like two different series. You've got sort of a high assumption and a low assumption that aemo provides for all of the different coal plants. And what the CSIRO did to get their high assumption was they just picked the absolute maximum highest price from those coal plants. And for the low assumption, they averaged the prices instead of picking the absolute minimum. So what that does is you have this really high price up here, and then the bottom gets shifted up a bit because it's averaged instead of being the minimum. So it just pushes things up and makes coal just that little bit more expensive. But when you fix it, you can clearly see that coal is much cheaper than renewables. And I think that accords with real life. So when we get modeling results that don't really make sense with reality, we've got to question, okay, what are the assumptions going into this and why are we getting such different results?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And this is what drives me crazy about this sort of stuff, because they have all this modeling, and then you have people like the teals running around and saying renewables is the cheapest form of energy, blah, blah, blah. But people are looking at their power bills and saying, well, a decade ago, 2 decades ago, when we were reliant on coal, we had cheap, reliable energy. I would turn the light on, the light would come on, no problem. I could run my dishwasher, I could run my air conditioning. I never had any thought about energy or electricity costs in the past, but now with all this renewable stuff going into the grid, suddenly my electricity bills are going up. We have politicians and premiers going on TV saying don't use your dishwasher and scale back your energy use. Something's definitely gone wrong. The real world is not matching what these politicians are saying. In your analysis, what are some of the most damaging policies or decisions that have been made when it comes to our electrical grid?
So I think one of the most damaging is actually in some ways one of the most hidden. So this is with rooftop solar. So essentially, rooftop solar owners are being cross-subsidized by everyone who doesn't have rooftop solar. So if you don't have solar panels on your roof, you're essentially paying your neighbors who do. And we've done extensive modeling on this. I've got a paper coming out soon called Rooftop Solar Paradise Lost. That should be coming out this week or next week. And that really goes into
people just get that at the website, see the CIS website.
So it will be, it'll be on the CIS website, and I've just filmed a video on that as well. So that will be on our YouTube channel soon. So definitely check that out.
Awesome.
But what we found is that rooftop solar is only providing 4 cents per kilowatt hour of generation to the grid. So theoretically, and that's at most. So theoretically, at most, if you're self-consuming your rooftop solar or exporting your rooftop solar, for every kilowatt hour that you self-consume or export, you should be paid probably 4 cents, maybe a bit less. But what's actually happening is across all of the states in the national grid, people are on average earning 8 to 18 cents per kilowatt hour. And that translates to up to $1,200 a year more that people are saving on their bills than they should be. And the problem with that is that if you're saving more money on your bills than the value you're actually providing to the grid, someone else has to cover that amount that you're saving. So the way that this happens is the structure of the network tariffs enables this. So network tariffs are what network companies charge to retailers, and then retailers pass that on to you as part of your bill. So the network component of the bill, it's usually about 30%, 40%, somewhere in that realm. You've got transmission and distribution. So it's basically the poles and wires of the grid. That's the network. And you have to pay fixed costs to cover that, but also there's a bit of variable cost in there, which is based on the peak. Because if you get more and more electricity consumption during the peak, like the absolute maximum peak, is what drives network costs in terms of upgrades, because you have to upgrade equipment so that it can deal with greater and greater amounts of consumption during those peak times. And so what happens is you'll notice in your electricity bill that you have a very small daily fixed charge, or relatively small. Most of your bill is going to be variable charges. And that makes sense for generation because the amount of energy that you consume is very sort of very correlated with the amount of costs that generators have to pay out, in terms of like coal and gas and all of that. The fuel costs drive a lot of the costs, and so it makes sense that you pay based on a variable charge for variable costs. But network companies recoup 60 to 75% of their costs, which are mostly fixed, through variable charges. So what that means is when a rooftop solar owner, they install rooftop solar, suddenly their consumption goes way down. Their bills then go way down because their bills are based on consumption. But network costs are not based on consumption. They're not just based on your general, how much you're consuming every day. They're based on fixed costs and the absolute maximum peak. And if you've got rooftop solar and it's a cloudy day, and that is the day when it's really, really hot and everyone comes home at the same time, they turn on all of their air cons and everything. And that happens to be the absolute peak day of the year. But it's in the evening and your rooftop solar panels aren't actually outputting anything then. You're contributing to that peak. You're contributing to network upgrade costs, just like your neighbor who doesn't have rooftop solar. So you shouldn't be saving anything more than they are, but you are. And so you have all these people saving all this money. And network companies, they're not actually, it's not like, oh, well, that just means that the network companies get less profit. The network companies' profits are guaranteed because they are regulated monopolies. So all they do is they figure out, okay, how do we recoup our costs from our customer base? And the regulator then approves that plan. So basically, if one group of customers is not paying their fair share of the network costs, which is what is happening through rooftop solar, then they have to recoup it from everyone else who doesn't have rooftop solar. So that's sort of the mechanism. It's very complicated. So I understand it's very hard to understand how this has arisen, and because it didn't used to be a problem. It's just now that we've gotten this technology where people are able to massively reduce their consumption while still, enjoying the full privilege of having full access to the grid all the time. So rooftop solar has really messed up the way our energy system works, and has created these distorted price signals. Because of course, if your bill is going up and you go, oh, I can get rooftop solar and I can save all this money, of course you're going to do that. Like, that's just, it makes financial sense for your household. And so of course, more and more people are going to buy it, but there's only so far that can go, because as you push up costs for everyone else, it creates, it's a death spiral essentially that happens. And so something has to give. It can't keep going, in that direction. And that's why we're seeing more and more government subsidies. We're seeing more and more handouts to try and alleviate the bill stress instead of actually fixing the problem and reducing the real costs of energy. So yes, this is something I'm very passionate about.
Well, it's like a reverse Robin Hood. You're taking from the poor and giving it to the rich. And it just, again, it shows how out of touch these politicians are. I mean, I've got a clip here of Zali Steggall This is her talking about how to bring down your electricity prices.
So the way Australians can reduce their power bills is buy less, right? Rely more and more on your own rooftop and buy less from the market. And then these hikes will not impact you. So the urgency is for the...
So what she's saying is if you don't want to have to, cop the increases in electricity prices, then you should get rooftop solar. Okay, great. But what happens if you're renting or you live in a unit? I mean, not everyone has their own home where they can put rooftop solar up. I mean, if you do, you're probably well off and doing quite well. But the people at the lower end of the scale that can't afford a home, are living in units, they can't do that. So it just shows how incredibly out of touch this woman is.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Everyone talks about with younger generations, housing affordability and all of this. And they don't seem to twig that, young people can't afford homes. And that means they also probably can't install rooftop solar. And then it comes into things like, raising a family, because you have young families who are really being hit by these electricity bill hikes because they can't reduce their consumption in the way that other people can. They have, they have these, inflexible consumers in their house, otherwise known as children, that they can't just say, no, Timmy, I'm not going to cook you dinner right now. Like it's, and so what happens is, because people think, pensioners are the ones that really struggle. And yes, there are a lot of pensioners struggling, but they actually are very flexible in their energy demands and can reduce their output during peak times to save money. But young families, not so much. And is that really, we've got a declining birth rate. Is that really what we want to be doing? Do we be wanting to make things harder on young families right now? There are more energy, because it's such a fundamental issue that impacts everyone's lives. It's not something you can mess around with. Like if you don't have that reliable, low cost energy that is on demand, if you're requiring instead consumers to be the flexible ones, then that's going to have opportunity costs. It's going to really impact your society. And I think that those negative impacts really haven't been thought through in this instance.
I want to bring up this article because when I've talked about rooftop solar in the past, it's really been based on this. It's an article by Matthew Warren in the Financial Review. Now, this was back in November of 2023. But in this article, he says the biggest hurdle to building a massed renewable energy and renewable engine to power our economy is the growing fleet of renewables already installed, because they all run at the same time. These headwinds are already materializing relatively early into the renewables adventure. Almost every day, 3.4 million rooftops generate more than 10,000 megawatts at their midday peak. This creates chronic oversupply, sending wholesale electricity prices negative. This means the value of any additional electricity from solar panels and other sources is beyond worthless to the grid. And he goes on to talk about when in the middle of the day and all the solar panels on people's rooftops are producing energy, but most people are at work and not using that energy, they have to dial down all the other energy generators, including coal. And they can't really do that because you can't turn a coal plant off and have it operating at night. You can't just turn it on, and it takes a long time to turn these things on. So you have to dial it all the way down. And a lot of the time they just pump that energy, that excess energy, into the ground, but it drives up the cost of producing coal, and thus that gets passed on to the consumer. So it's a big reason why our energy prices are going up, because we have all this abundant energy in the middle of the day where we don't really need it. But when everyone's home at night, using their TVs, using their air conditioning, using it, all the lights are on, everything's happening. There's no sun, so solar panels are not working, but we still need that coal backup. So it's a real imbalance with the energy system.
Yes, I think it really comes down to the question of what is the dispensable part of the system and what is the indispensable part of the system. And the indispensable part is that dispatchable power, which currently for us is coal and gas and a bit of hydro, and it could be nuclear. But the dispensable part is rooftop solar. And if you got rid of that, because I don't actually think that rooftop solar saves on like capital costs for other generators, because you still have to fully back it up. If you have any period where you've got a very small amount of sunlight, then you're going to have to pretty much cover all of that capacity. Like comparing, and that's a common mistake that you'll see in these energy debates, where people will compare the capacity of, say, a coal plant and the capacity of solar panels as the same thing, when they're actually apples and oranges, because you have to know how much is it actually outputting on average, what's the capacity factor, to know the value to the grid. But I think the funny thing is that when people say, like, there's a lot of scaremongering around nuclear plants and saying, oh, this nuclear plant would turn off your rooftop solar, like it would force your rooftop solar out of the grid and you wouldn't get paid what you deserve for it. What's going to do that even more than a nuclear plant is actually your neighbor's rooftop solar. Because when your rooftop solar is outputting power during the middle of the day, because your suburb is sunny, guess who else is doing that? Your neighbors, because it's also sunny there, because you have this very, very, very high level of correlation in these particular areas. And so it's very funny when people think that nuclear is somehow the thing that's going to destroy people's investments in rooftop solar, when actually it's just more rooftop solar. So those who have rooftop solar really should be advocating for no one else to get it. But yeah, that's kind of just a very ironic point that we've got to.
That's another argument that he makes later in this argument. This article. The more renewables that you add to the grid, the more problems it causes, and you're actually getting diminishing returns. So
yes,
we have to. Yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, this is the idea of like the renewables honeymoon period, and our team's writing a paper on this at the moment. And essentially, it's usually estimates vary as to when the honeymoon period ends. It could be as low as 20%, could be 40%, maybe 50%. But and the Paul Simshauser, the research that I mentioned before that he did on gas, he basically indicated it's 20%, which is a lot lower than what we originally thought, which is quite interesting. But essentially, when you're in the honeymoon period, when you have very low penetrations of renewables in the grid, then things are pretty easy. Everything's still pretty cheap. It's very easy to add it in. All the dispatchable generators kind of just soak it up. And they're all providing all of these system stability services as a byproduct, because they have these huge, big spinning turbines in coal and gas and hydro plants that have all this inertia. And so, and you don't really need batteries. You don't need any of the expensive stuff. But once you start getting up to 20%, 40%, 50%, that's when things start to get expensive, because you start getting these problems of minimum demand in the middle of the day, which rooftop solar is causing. Which really stresses the grid. You start getting, there's just this lack of stability that requires synchronous condensers. You need these big synthetic inertia generating machines, because you're reducing the amount of coal and gas and hydro, or dispatchable generators in the grid. And you need all of these batteries. You just have to spend so much more. So there's kind of a step change that occurs, and it's not just this constant linear progression of costs. It's this, things are really easy and suddenly they're not, and they get worse and worse and worse. And so the problem is, a lot of politicians will walk around with, I think, a graph in their head essentially of, oh, we just need to spend a little bit more, we just need to give a little bit more subsidies, and we'll get over the hump, and then things will be downhill and it'll be easy from there. And they don't realize it's not just a hump. This is an uphill mountain climb that doesn't end. So trying to, I think that paper, once we finish that will be very important, I think, in this whole debate of dispelling the myth around things will get easier in future if we keep going down this renewables path.
And Australia is very different than other countries. I mean, sometimes they'll point to California or Germany that has a lot of renewables, and when they have that excess supply, they can sell it to other parts of their neighbors, whether it be other states in America or other countries in Europe. We can't do that here in Australia. There's no one that we can offload all that excess energy to. And they're talking about batteries and pumped hydro. We just don't have the geology for pumped hydro. And look what's happened with the snowy hydro too. So we're running into big problems with this sort of stuff, aren't we?
Yeah. I mean, pumped hydro is just not a good idea because, and look, even if you were going to do a fully renewable system, pumped hydro would be the last piece of the puzzle because it's that really, really deep storage, but it's very expensive. You wouldn't do that first. And unfortunately, the government back in the day decided, let's do that as one of the first things we do. And now we're facing consequences. Now it's blown out 6 times what it's originally meant to be. It's probably going to blow out again. I've heard that it'll be even higher than 12 billion because I think there was some explosion recently or something. There's always some issue with Story 2.0. But yes, so that's a terrible idea. But also the interesting thing is we do have multiple states in our country, not quite the scale of the US, but we have states like South Australia that are very, very high renewables penetrations. But as soon as that interconnector goes down with Victoria, that's giving them, coal energy, they're screwed. And I think that they realize that. And I think that South Australian Labor are probably the most pro-nuclear Labor Party in the country. That, from what I can tell, I think that Peter Malinauskas is very pro-nuclear and would be very keen to jump on board if the coalition do get in the federal election. And I think good on him because essentially he's the one right at the coalface. He's the one seeing what's happening with these huge penetrations of rooftop solar and all of this wind and solar, and something happens, grid goes down, and the state is screwed. And so I think, sometimes it's those who've gone furthest down the path that can actually tell the rest of us, hey, this is not really working, and maybe we need to rethink this. But yes, I think we'll see what happens because that is the issue. Is that yes, when we're not like Europe, we're not all interconnected with other countries. We can't just chuck a cable to France and get their nuclear power if we've gone fully renewables. So we need to tread carefully.
Now, I want to talk about this this news that's come out. This is an article from Sky News. It says the Albanese government faces backlash as energy prices set to skyrocket amid all renewable energy policy rollout. And this relates to the Australian Energy Regulator draft default market offers for 2024-2025. And it's, saying that our electricity prices are going to go up even further. What can you tell us about that?
So the DMO, the default market offer, that gets released, I think it's every year or so. And essentially that gives a ceiling to retailers of how much they can charge customers. So it's because we have this competitive sort of retail market where retailers will give customers discounts to try and get new customers in. So actually there's this thing called the loyalty tax where if you've stayed with your retailer for a long time, you're probably paying more than you should. You can probably get a cheaper plan elsewhere, which is just another thing wrong with our energy system because then it means people have to constantly change plans all the time. And a lot of people are just overwhelmed by the complexity of energy plans and, why should we be spending our time on that? But putting that aside, so the default market offer is there to make sure that retailers can't just fully price gouge customers who are not able to get the best deal for themselves. But it's a good proxy for how costs are going up. It's a good way to see, are prices, are they going up or are they going down? What's happening? And it's interesting because the regulator who determines the default market offer really, really doesn't want prices to go up because of renewables. Like the Australian Energy Regulator is fully on board the renewables train. They don't want renewables to be blamed for high prices. But even they had to say that I think it was low wind output and maybe solar as well were responsible this time for the increases. And they also said, but it's also Ukraine and everything with the coal prices and and that kind of thing. I think coal often gets blamed, and that's like Bowen jumped on board of that and said, look, it's unreliable coal's fault that the prices went up. when like what's making coal unreliable? Well, they're aging plants and we haven't replaced them. That's what's making them unreliable. It's not any inherent thing about coal as an energy source. But yeah, and there's also the question of if you have a coal like export exposed mine, then that's going to be more expensive than when you have situations with coal plants that have a captive mine that they're able to get really cheap coal from. So there's a number of factors in there, but essentially there's no way for the regulator to hide the fact that prices are going up. And they actually they have done something, and they did a similar thing last time to do their best to reduce the price increase. And what they did was they got rid of the competitive margin. So usually they have a margin in there to help promote competition in the energy retail space. But what they said was, because of inflation, we need to get rid of the competitive margin. So they're essentially almost acting like the Reserve Bank for energy by making decisions on margins and things based on the interest rate, and like it doesn't really make sense. Like why would they change the kind of financial settings of this thing now instead of just going, okay, well the costs of these inputs are this, and so therefore this is going to be the output, right? Like they're making these decisions that aren't just here's a formula and this is the result of what's fair to charge customers. So you really have to wonder, like, there's a lot of motivated actors in this space, and they clearly seem motivated to hide the fact that renewables are increasing prices. And so I think there's more to come, essentially. Like this increase, they've tried to reduce as much as possible. So we can expect next time there's going to be another increase, because it's like trying to hold a balloon underwater. Like it's just going to keep coming up.
That's pretty scary. I think people are struggling already. They don't, that's the worst news that you could possibly give them. All right.
Yeah, I think things have to get worse until they get better, unfortunately, but I hope they can get better. But that depends on what the voters do. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's put you in the hot seat now, Zoe. Now, let's say tomorrow you wake up and suddenly you're climate change and energy minister. And I know a lot of this is state government policy as well, but let's say you're in charge of Australia's electrical grid. What would you like to see happen? How can we secure our energy grid for the future?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, because it really depends on how much do you value emissions reduction. And I don't want to be making that decision for Australians. I don't want to be saying we shouldn't care about emissions reduction at all, or we should make it the be all and end all. Like, I don't want to be making that decision. I just want to give people the knowledge that they need to make those decisions about those appropriate trade-offs. So if I was the climate change and energy minister and people said, we don't care about emissions reduction anymore, give us the cheapest energy, which would probably mean I'd be the energy minister, not the climate change anyway. But in that situation, then I would stop building all of these transmission lines immediately that are supporting, basically only there to support renewables. I'd stop giving subsidies to renewables in general, just stop all subsidies. And I would start building coal plants, because if all we care about is cost, that is the way to get low cost energy. We just replace our aging coal plants. And in terms of gas, then there'd also be, I'd have to figure out a policy on that, but I won't go into too much detail. Whereas if I was climate change and energy minister, and it was clear that the Australian people did really want to still pursue emissions reduction, then I would still stop building transmission lines. I would still stop giving all these subsidies to renewables, but I would probably try and really get gas reserves going for the short term, and invest heavily in that, but try to get nuclear on the road so that we can get that as soon as possible to make sure that we can replace our coal plants with nuclear. That would be the best way to get to, maybe not net zero, but very, very low emissions, while still having reasonable costs. Yes, nuclear is more expensive than coal, but we can see through international examples that nuclear can give us low-cost energy, relatively speaking, and most importantly, it gives us reliable energy. And it has a lot of other good benefits as well. So yes, so I'm sorry I can't give you like a one single answer, but I think it's important to acknowledge the complexity and the different different motivations that people have when it comes to energy.
No, I really like that answer. That was a really interesting answer. I hadn't thought about it before, like that way before. Like how you distinguish the difference between, wanting to reduce emissions and just getting cheap energy, then you would go for coal. Where if you wanted to reduce emissions, you'd go for nuclear. I don't think. I mean, and this goes back to what we were saying before. I think we lose sight of the initial argument. Like why have we gone down this path? We get so muddled up with all different policies and arguments and proposals and all that sort of stuff. We lose sight of the core foundation of why we went on this journey in the first place. And look, I'm one of the people that have jumped on the nuclear bandwagon just because I didn't know much about it in the beginning, and I was very wary of it. And through my research and through this podcast and having people on, I've come around on nuclear energy, but I haven't really gone back and gone, well, if we are going to introduce it, what are the reasons why? Is it to get cheap energy, or is it just to reduce emissions? And you're saying if we just want to get back to cheap, reliable energy, we don't need to go down that path. We can just stick with coal. Would you have any nuclear at all?
So I think like in the long term, like if we're talking, I don't know, 1,000 years, then yes, like we would probably go nuclear. So I guess I'm more thinking in terms of the next 100 years in that sort of time frame. But that's like, I think that there is a reason why we were going to go down the nuclear path, like back in I think the 60s, and they started building, they started clearing land for a plant near Jervis Bay, but we didn't ultimately. And I think one of the biggest reasons was just because we do have such cheap coal. But it really comes down to that trade-off. And so if what Australians want is they want low emissions energy, then nuclear is just a no-brainer. Like we have to do nuclear because renewables won't work. Like renewables definitely will not work, and there will be a disaster. And so nuclear is the path ahead if we're willing to pay a little bit more, but we really are like, we need to reduce emissions. That would be the way to go in that situation. But it really, it just comes down to what we value. And if we want dirt cheap energy, the truth is that coal will always be the cheapest for us, at least for the next however many centuries we have coal reserves for.
Yeah, no, it's a good way of thinking about things. I really like that answer. Now, if you really enjoyed this podcast with Zoe today and you are in Sydney, please come along to the Securing Our Energy Future Symposium. As I mentioned in the beginning of the show, she'll be speaking alongside Jared Holland, Paul Vallejo, and also Senator Matt Canavan. It's on Wednesday, April 2nd at 7 p.m. at the Balgala Bowling Club. As I said, tickets are only $25, so it's a real bargain to hear these wonderful speakers. And you just head to commandingthenarrative.com and click the link at the bottom. It says get your tickets here. And it is a Liberal Party event, but don't hold that against them because it is a good branch. I can vouch for the branch putting on this event. It's a very well run branch and a lot of good people in there. And look, the significance of this, it's smack bang in Zali Steggall's electorate of Warringah. So there's going to be a lot of people in that electorate who are going to be interested in this talk. And I encourage everyone to come along. And if we can get as many people there as we can, and to hear some common sense and some rational arguments as Zoe has put forward today, I think it's going to be very, very important. It is right before the election, so it's going to be a great night. So, Zoe, are you going to be talking about rooftop solar, or have you thought about what you're going to be speaking about at this symposium?
Yes, I'm happy to talk about rooftop solar. I'll definitely be talking about the cost comparisons between renewables and nuclear and coal. So in terms of the gencost graphs that I show, I'll want to be going through that in a bit more detail, so people can really understand what the real costs look like.
Yeah, awesome. And if you want to hear more from Zoe, you can head to the CIS website, but you can also head to their YouTube channel. So it's Center for Independent Studies on YouTube, or at CISAUS. And you can see there's a whole host of great videos on there. And Zoe's the face of a lot of them, talking about nuclear and talking about gencost and talking about a whole different scope of issues. So check out the CIS YouTube page and catch all her previous videos. They're very, very good. And also, as I said, head to the CIS website, cis.org.au, and you'll be releasing this report in the next few days. So we're looking forward to that one, about the rooftop solar. How many pages is this report? Is there a lot of reading involved? Or?
Okay, it's 22,000 words, I think, but you can just read the executive summary. You don't have to read the whole thing if you don't want to. It's just, all of the analysis is just there so that people who really want to test the ideas and understand all of the nuances can read those sections if they want to. But if you want the main takeaways, the executive summary will be much shorter.
Awesome, fantastic. Well, look, thank you so much for coming on today, and thank you for all the work that you're doing. You're putting out these arguments and actually going through stuff like gencost and going through with a fine-tooth comb and really holding them to account. And I think that needs to happen more in politics these days. Politicians and all these different groups need to be held to account. It's very important, and it's just a shame that it's such a complex issue. I think a lot of people don't really have time to really delve into it as well as they probably should, because votes are dependent on a lot of these issues, and that's how we get a lot of these policies at the end of the day. But thank you for coming on today and maybe encapsulating it a little bit more, and hopefully we can have you back in the future.
Would love to. Thanks so much, Stephen.
Great, thank you. And thank you everyone for watching. As I say it every single time, please share this out. It's some really interesting information today, a lot of technical information, but it's also important. So please share it far and wide. I rely on you, the audience, to get this information out there. I'm hopeless with social media, so I really rely on you guys. And thank you very much for watching. We'll see you all next time. Bye.